Hi everyone, I'm Angelina, and for the past 3 weeks I was helping out with the UConn program here, which is the University of Connecticut American English Language Institute. And with UConn, they teach students who don't natively speak English. They just teach them to speak English. And a lot of the students here are conditional undergraduate students. So they're accepted into the university, except they have to pass through this program if they want to hold their acceptance and actually attend UConn as freshmen. I also worked with Dr. Harry Vanderholst. He's a linguist here. I worked with him before and after Senior Summit discussing linguistic studies and theories. Using what I talked about with Dr. Vanderholst and what I was observing in my UConn classes, I came to realize that there are certain things that make teaching English as a second language very difficult. Of course, there are many things that make teaching a language very difficult, but I'm only going to talk about 4 today. The first factor that makes teaching English difficult is knowledge of one's native language is often subconscious. So when we learn our first language, we aren't really learning it, we're more absorbing it. It's not something we have to attempt to do, it doesn't require effort. So we don't often know how the language works on a technical level because we never have to question it. Whereas when you're learning a language as your second language, it's a laborious effort, it's very conscious, it takes a lot of practice and drilling it into your mind. The issue with that is that people just, like I said, often don't have a technical knowledge of their language, so from a non-native perspective, explaining it will be a little hard. An example of this is the use of articles. In English we have articles, and beyond that we have indefinite and definite articles. And we as native speakers know how to use articles. If someone asks me, hey, in this situation would I use a definite article or an indefinite article, I could answer that. But if someone asks me, why am I going to use an indefinite article versus a definite article, I probably would have a lot more trouble answering that because I've never had to think of it from an objective point of view. Another example of this is the difference grammatically between an order and a suggestion. If someone read a sentence and they said, was that an order or suggestion? I could tell them what it was, but if they asked me, how would I differentiate between an order or suggestion based on the grammar that they used, I probably wouldn't be able to answer that as well as I would want to because I never had to think about how to use my language technically. And that makes it hard to teach English because if you don't know how to explain it to someone who has no background knowledge of it, it's going to be very hard to explain. The second factor into this is phonological differences between languages are usually not properly acknowledged. As native English speakers, we know how English should sound, and if somebody says a word with an accent, we'll know that they're saying it with an accent, and we'll know how to say it correctly, but we won't know why we're saying it correctly or how we're saying it correctly. We won't know how we're using our mouth and our tongue to produce the words. So if you have a student and they're saying a word incorrectly, you could say, no, just say it like this. But you won't be able to tell them how to say it like that. An example of this is if you were teaching a Dutch student English, they would probably say the word top, they would say top. They would cut it off, it would sound different. And you would say, no, just say top. And then they wouldn't understand. They would probably get it once they heard it enough, because that's how humans work. But the reason it's different is because in English, a T is pronounced with aspiration at the beginning of a word, whereas in Dutch, it's not. I didn't know that until Dr. Vanderholst told me. So if I had come across a Dutch student, I wouldn't have been able to tell them that, because I wouldn't have known. So I wouldn't have been able to say, just bring air from the back of your mouth into the front of your mouth. You'll be aspirating your T. They wouldn't have known that, and it would have been a lot harder to explain to them how to pronounce the word correctly. The third factor is, I'm going to switch over here. The third factor is that idiomatic and metaphoric phrases are often hard to translate well. So first off, idiomatic phrases, metaphors, they're very rich in culture and history. And often that's hard to explain if someone doesn't already share a language with you. Another issue with idioms and metaphors is that idioms have essentially become one phrase, one word semantically. So if you break it up, it loses its meaning completely. An example of this is every cloud has a silver lining. All the native English speakers in here know what that means. It means that every bad situation has some good in it, even if you don't acknowledge it at first. But if we were explaining that to a non-native speaker, we would say, oh, well, every means all. That's a cloud. There's a silver lining. But it wouldn't make sense anymore because it has its meaning holistically. So if you break it up to try and explain it, it just doesn't make sense anymore. And another issue with this is metaphors run very deep in our language to the point where we probably won't notice that we're using them. An example of this that I was talking about with Dr. Vanderholst is saying, the water runs. To native speakers, we know it means the water flows. It flows out of a sink, flows in a river, the water runs. But to a non-native speaker, they could say, the water runs, where is it running? It doesn't have legs, how's it doing that? And it just wouldn't make sense, but we wouldn't have to think about that because we just know what it means growing up with the language. So when a teacher is teaching an idiomatic phrase or a metaphor, you have to make sure you explain the cultural context and the historical context and explain that it's a phrase. It doesn't mean its literal translation in order to have them fully understand what the language means. And the last factor is that differing lexicons affect one's perception of the world. If a certain word doesn't exist in a student's language, teaching them the actual word will be relatively easy, but teaching them the concept behind the word will be a lot harder. An example that I use for this is if somebody's language didn't have a word for chair and a word for couch, they just had couch and little couch, they wouldn't have a concept of what a chair is. A chair would only exist as a smaller version of a couch. It wouldn't exist as its own entity. So they could see the difference between this is like a chair, what we call a chair, and this is a couch. They could see the difference, but they wouldn't think of the chair as a chair. It would be a completely separate meaning because it would be part of a couch, if that makes sense. That's a very extreme example, and I haven't come across any examples that extreme, but I'm sure everybody has heard in a language classroom, oh, well, I would tell you, but that word doesn't really exist in my language. Or, oh yeah, that would make sense, but that word doesn't really have meaning to us. So it's a little bit hard to explain something when it doesn't exist in another person's language, and that's why a teacher must be aware of the words and what they mean in like our culture or what a word means in their students' culture so they could try and understand the concepts behind it. My conclusion is that we have both technical, more grammatical sides, and we have more cultural, conceptual sides of this. And in conclusion, we need to, I guess we don't need to, but we should have a background knowledge of your student's language, and we should look objectively at our own language to better understand where your students are coming from and where you're coming from linguistically, so you can explain your language better. And also, it's important to remember that when you're teaching a language, you're not only teaching a language in the sense that you're not going to just sit your student down with a grammar book and say, okay, read this and then you'll know English. You're also teaching your students another way to see the world through the lens of a language. Thank you. Any questions? Yeah?
I have a question. So do you think that you could see yourself pursuing a career in like teaching ESL or like English or just like a major or something like that?
It's actually interesting you ask because I knew for a while that I wanted to study linguistics and study Italian, but like together. And people would ask me, oh, what do you want to do with that? Do you want to be like a translator? And I would say, I don't really know what I want to do with it, but I'm sure I'll find something. So when I was in UConn, I started to think, oh, maybe it would be really interesting to teach English, along with the fact that I want to learn a lot of foreign languages and I want to travel a lot. So it would be interesting if I could learn a foreign language, go to that country and help teach English, where I would be helping myself learn their language and I would be helping them learn my language. So I actually do think that I could see myself doing this in the future. Any others? Yeah?
You're an English teacher. How would you teach us, in what ways would you teach us your way, like for a second language student?
I would try to incorporate what I said here. Another thing that I would do that I didn't mention is I would use a lot more pictures because visuals are universal, whereas words differ between languages, obviously. So if you show someone a picture of a tree, they're going to know it's a tree, and you can say the word tree, and they'll associate it with that image. So they'll walk around campus and they'll be like, oh, it's a tree. Every time they see a tree, it'll better be in their memory, and also it's a better way to explain it because I think a lot gets lost in translation. Anyone else? Okay. Well, I want to thank Dr. Vanderholst, Professor Slayton, Kelly. Chris Pallas isn't here, and neither is Miss Pat, but there are other teachers I worked with. I'd like to thank Patrick and the entire Kent Cooke Foundation and all of the students I worked with because it was very fun, and I think they're all great people, and I think they're going to do really well in the University of Connecticut or getting your law degree or in optics or in anything that you guys pursue, and I had a lot of fun. Thank you.